Professor Werner is with us, and it's always quite an honor to have Richard here. I know that he's quite busy, and he's very much in high demand these days. And it looks like you're in a beautiful place. Wow, there's no masks or lockdowns, so very nice. And so it's really quite an honor to have you here today. And Professor Werner wants to talk a little bit about the case for abundance. High sustainable growth and prosperity are possible. Why don't we get them? So yeah, let's just jump right into it. Please go ahead.
Very good. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for the invitation. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we hear you. I shall
share the screen in a moment, and then you won't be distracted by the picture of the Alps. And I apologize for the cowbells in the background that may occasionally get louder, but perhaps that's quite soothing. So here's my presentation.
Yeah, we can see.
Is the sharing working? Switching to presentation mode, yeah?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Excellent. All right. So let's start. The first slide is headed with the phrase, the promises of economics. Economics in the 20th century has been overall a somewhat optimistic discipline. And there have been bouts and periods of very positive predictions that have been made. One such instance was in 1928, when the probably most famous single economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, gave a lecture. And in this lecture said, let's look at the future. Let's look a century ahead, and let's see what we should expect in 100 years' time. And of course, that's quite interesting for us because, hey, we're almost there. It's now 2022, so there's only 6 years. So essentially, we're through that century. There shouldn't be, hopefully, too many dramatic surprises in the last 6 years. Let's see how Keynes's prediction about the future panned out. Now, his central prediction in this lecture, and also, written up as an article entitled "Possibilities for Our Grandchildren," was that economic growth would generate so much productivity growth and income growth and per capita income growth, and therefore prosperity, that essentially people no longer have to work. I guess most of us still feel the need to work. So something did go wrong with his prediction. Now, the funny thing is that when you look at his calculations, his range of expected productivity growth and per capita income growth, which was, that it would rise between between 4 and 8 times actually over this time period. This was true. In fact, we came in at the upper end of his predicted forecasting range. So in other words, the prosperity that he was forecasting was achieved. But we still have to work. So why is that? What did he get wrong? Well, the trouble with per capita income figures and essentially all these macro figures is that they're aggregates, and they don't tell you anything about how all this prosperity is distributed. What we find is that the more optimistic side of his forecast came true. As much prosperity as he was hoping in his maximum optimal scenario was actually generated in the past century. But a very small number of people managed to lay claim to all those per capita income gains. And therefore, because the average doesn't tell you how many people actually get this, the majority still has to work. And that's something that Keynes totally underestimated. So he got this inequality wrong, and that is likely due to the fact that he underestimated the mechanism that generates this inequality. And that's something we need to look at. And of course, that mechanism is the monetary system. Now, then we had the Second World War, and then in the 50s and 60s, again, economists became very optimistic. And in fact, economic growth seemed very high in the 50s and 60s. Income growth was high. Working hours did go down and were not overly burdensome. And so it looked like, oh, we could go back on this very positive trajectory. But then something else got in the way, and that is something I'm going to talk about a little more. But beforehand, I just want to ask the question, was it reasonable of people to be so optimistic in the 50s and 60s? Was it reasonable for Keynes in the 1920s to be so optimistic that, you know, there will be so much prosperity that we won't have to work? Well, it was actually a reasonable expectation, as JFK Kennedy would have, I believe, agreed. He said, our problems are man-made, therefore they may be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. It was a reasonable expectation, but it didn't come through because problems exist in our system that we have to tackle. But to do that, we need to understand them first. And that's also where there has been a bit of a problem, even in economics, a lack of understanding of the key issues. What happened in the 1970s is that suddenly the prosperity, decades of wealth generation, income generation came to a halt. In many countries, economic growth came to a halt and prices rose. So we had inflation and economic stagnation at the same time, what was therefore called stagflation, because that is highly, highly current, sadly, because growth has been ground to a halt in quite a number of countries in 2020, 21, and also now it looks like a number of countries are heading back into recession, while at the same time prices are rising significantly. So let's analyze this a little bit, because a lot of people presently are clearly worried about inflation. What are the implications? What's the role of our monetary system in all this? And what are the lessons to learn also for our monetary system? Now, when you look at this inflation, and it's well known, and this is something that's not controversial, there were essentially two bouts of high inflation in the 1970s. One was around 1974. As you can see here, this is US data. There was an initial peak at 11%, and then a second peak at 13.5% at the end of the 70s in 1980. That was this inflationary decade. So in between, there was a bit of a calming down of the inflation, but overall, well, the problem recurred. So what was that? I mean, what really caused this inflation? First, this first bout, and then secondly, in the late 70s. I think it's something we need to understand to then also apply that knowledge to the present situation. The data for other countries, I mean, that was the US. For other countries is quite similar. In Germany, overall, the figures were more modest. The peak inflation in the 70s was in 1973 at 7%. The US peak, as you saw, 13.5%, similar to Sweden, 13.7%. But there was another category of countries such as Japan, the UK, also Italy. They had much higher inflation, 23%, 24%. That in itself already raises a number of questions, because you see this huge range of inflation scenarios. And of course, the official narrative is this inflation is due to the oil shock, external events. Well, if that's true, why did countries experience such diverse stagflation responses in terms of both their stagnation of growth, and the degree of inflation. So what really caused this, and what can explain these different numbers? The official story, remember, is, and then still is the story that's being spread today, is that it's an oil price shock due initially to a war in the Middle East that resulted in an oil embargo, which is an oil supply shock, sanctions. At that time, they were against the US and allied countries, therefore much of Europe. And so, wow, I mean, that sounds almost identical to, of course, what's been happening this year. And that's why it's all the more important to really analyze this and understand this. But look at the timing. This war started in October 1973. In October 1973. As you saw in some countries, that was already beyond the peak of inflation at that time, in this first bout of inflation. So this war came actually quite late in the game. And when did actually the oil prices rose? They only rose from September, October 73 at $12 per barrel of oil. $3 per barrel of oil to 12. So they quadrupled in this time period and until January. So from October to January, a quadrupling of oil prices. The interesting is less really this quantitative increase in prices, but the timing. This didn't happen before the end of September 73. But as I said, the inflation was actually in many countries highest before September 73. And that tells you it cannot possibly be the oil price increase that caused this. So what really was the cause? Well, to answer that question, we need some deeper analysis. Of course, the official narrative is always, it's the outside, it's external events, it's not us. It's things that are outside our control. That's what we hear today in 2022. The inflation that many countries are experiencing, which is still accelerating in most countries, is due to external events, a war in Europe, quoting from the Federal Reserve, and related events are creating additional upward pressure on inflation and are weighing on global economic activity. So it's the war that's the fault. But of course, the war only started at the end of February. Now, if we really want to hold the planners and decision makers to account, we also need to say what they've said about the recurrence of a 1970s scenario. The ECB vowed in 2000, when it was a fairly new institution, that something like the oil price shock wouldn't really happen in the same way anymore, because now the Eurozone is much better prepared to handle this situation. Well, doesn't look like it, does it? So in the 70s, we were told that the high aspirations of prosperity for all, which technically was possible, as Keynes had calculated, could now not be fulfilled because of this adverse supply shock. Energy had to be rationed in many European countries. Germany, I remember, there was literal rationing. You could not use your car on every day, only every other day, and it was divided into whether your registration number had odd or even numbers, at the end. So that was to reduce the consumption of fuel and things like that. So clear Soviet-style rationing was introduced, and of course that's already happening in Europe at the moment. So the narrative is the same, but was this official narrative that we know from the 70s actually true? Let's analyze the 70s because we have all the data going back. Was it really due to an external shock and war and sanctions? Now, to analyze this, we need a set of tools. We need to know, of course, how the economy really works. And for that, you need to know the secrets of the banking trade and the rules of the money game. So I start here with the one thing that the economists of all the various different schools of thought agree on, and that is that the most important variable to explain economic activity and explain the economy is interest rates. And that's, of course, why central banks are moving interest rates. That's why recently they've been raising rates, because that's their set of tools to manipulate the economy. That's what we're told. You see here all these different schools of thought, from classical, neoclassical, Keynesian monetarist onwards to present day dominant new classical approaches and even alternative approaches. They all agree on this, that lower rates lead to higher growth and higher rates slow growth. And that's why now they're raising rates. You could even call this interest rate thesis, that interest rates move the economy in the opposite direction, so an inverse correlation and causation from interest rates to growth. You could call that the law and the prophets in economics. Well, I should be more precise, because what you see here, all these different schools of thought are essentially English language economics, and that really is equilibrium economics. Now, how many studies were there that have actually demonstrated the truth of this much repeated claim? And you've heard it hundreds of times. It's mentioned usually on a daily basis, whether it's in the financial news or by central banks or commentators and analysts and reports. They're moving rates because that will slow the economy and things like that. So you'd think there's hundreds, if not thousands, of empirical studies that have demonstrated this. Well, actually, no, there were no studies whatsoever. So the last 200 years of equilibrium economic thought, English language, modern economics, since Ricardo, essentially, as it turns out, was not based on empirical evidence. This idea doesn't come from facts, it comes from theory. So let's check the facts first before we return to theory. There's two papers, you can look them up. If you Google them, Reconsidering Monetary Policy, written with a co-author, Kang-Suk Lee, who's at the one of the European central banks, an econometrician, published in Ecological Economics 2018. And this year, again with Kang-Suk, another paper, are lower interest rates really associated with higher growth? And of course, that also means are higher rates really associated with lower inflation? New empirical evidence from 19 countries. I'll just present you very quickly with the result in a nutshell. What we found is that if you just check objectively what is the relationship between interest rates and growth, it's not a negative correlation. You get, as you see on the left side here, up in the upper and the lower graph, positive correlation. Higher interest rates and higher growth go hand in hand, and lower interest rates and lower growth. Then the question becomes a question of timing, which is also a question of statistical causation. And what we find is that interest rates always follow economic growth. Sometimes they're coincidental, but they almost never lead economic growth. And that's what we found with our econometric analysis and also with the Granger causality tests. And interestingly, that's actually in many ways well recognized by the business cycle researchers in the US. The Department of Commerce, the government, has leading indicators of the economy, coincident indicators of the economy, and with economy we mean GDP growth, and lagging indicators of GDP growth. In fact, therefore, all the regular statistics that are being announced, industrial production, GDP itself, of course, but housing starts and machine tool orders, machinery orders, import exports, the whole range, money supply, and of course also interest rates. They're categorized into these three categories. Look them up. Where will you find interest rates? Are they really a leading indicator of economic growth? Oh, they're not among the leading indicators. I wonder why. They're not even among the coincident indicators. They are a lagging indicator, because the official story that higher rates lead to lower growth and lower rates lead to higher growth is confronted by the empirical reality that actually interest rates and growth are positively correlated, and rates follow growth. They're a lagging indicator. You cannot forecast the economy with this, and therefore they're also not useful the way theory has been saying this as a monetary policy tool. Rates are the result of growth, and therefore they can't be the cause. So the official story is rejected, and in those papers it's very clear, and the evidence is quite astonishing. I mean, for example, the positive correlation between rates and growth is just so overwhelming. Have a look at those. Of course, that raises a number of other questions, like why on earth do they keep telling us this official narrative when really it's not true? And of course, another question is, if it's not rates that's driving the economy, what is? And of course, these two are connected, because the answer to the first is, why do they keep talking about rates? Is because it's a smokescreen. It's to distract you from finding out what really is driving the economy and understanding what's really happening. What really is driving the economy is something else. It is not interest rates. Central banks don't use rates to grow the economy. It's something else. But today, central bankers once again claim that the present inflation is due to a war in Europe, supply and energy price shock. There's various statements here from the ECB suggesting that, when there's no empirical evidence. So this has to be classified as propaganda. There's no evidence even that lowering rates raises growth, and raising rates slows growth or inflation. That's why some of the monetary policy makers have come out and have said things like Dame Kate Barker of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee has said, "I've come to wonder about my time at the Monetary Policy Committee setting interest rates. It's been a bit of a waste of time, really." Well, we could have told her that, and we did tell her that, because interest rates follow growth. So that should, of course, be food for thought. And one question then is, well, why on earth, well, where on earth did people get this idea from, that interest rates are this key variable? Well, that's not based on empirical evidence, as you've seen. It's based on theory. And here's the theory. For those of you who have not studied economics, here it is, the one chart in economics. We are in price and quantity space, and we have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve used for all markets, whether individual product markets, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, or the labor market. Then the quantity, of course, is L, the quantity of labor, and the price is the wage. Or you're using this for money or credit, then that's the quantity, and the price is the interest rate. What we find is that, well, this story that is told says it's prices that are key, because the prices move to give you that point where demand equals supply equilibrium. And if you're off equilibrium, of course, prices will move and give you that equilibrium. You know, excess supply means prices are too high. That drives down prices when they can't sell their stuff, when it's too expensive, and so on. Well, that is quite a tempting argument, persuasive argument, but don't be fooled. Read the small print. The small print is that at least 8 conditions have to be met. 8 assumptions have to hold at the same time jointly, namely the fairly sweeping assumptions and far-reaching assumptions of perfect information, complete markets, perfect competition, instantaneous price adjustments, zero transaction costs, no time constraints, profit maximization of rational agents, and the assumption that people are not influenced by others, by the actions of others, or care even about others. One could spend considerable time going through what each assumption means if it was true, and what the world would look like if it was true. It's clear the world would look very different to the world we're living in. So these assumptions describe a place that may exist on some far-flung planet in some galaxy that hasn't been discovered yet, but it's very clear it does not apply to planet Earth. So how can it be that 200 years of economics were based on this fictional theory of equilibrium, when really, there is no equilibrium, because the assumptions requiring equilibrium are too stringent? But based on this theory, prices are key, because prices move to give us equilibrium. That's where the interest rate story comes from, because the price of money is the interest rate. That's the overarching price that moves the economy. That's the argument. And that's why, hence this interest rate thesis. So it's entirely based on theory in a fictional world. Well, I can tell you where this comes from. It comes from the methodology used in economics. In general, there's two fundamental approaches to scientific research. One is the inductive approach and one is the deductive approach. The inductive approach infers general laws from particular instances. The deductive approach is, it's slightly more convoluted, and so I better quote verbatim, and we want to be very brief here, so I quote the Britannica Concise Encyclopedia. Apologies for the length. In logic, the procedure by which an entire science or system of theorems is deduced in accordance with specified rules by logical deduction from certain basic propositions known as axioms, which in turn are constructed from a few terms taken as primitive. These terms may be either arbitrarily defined or conceived according to a model in which some intuitive warrant for their truth is felt to exist. I'd like to emphasize here the words arbitrarily defined, conceived, intuitive, and felt to exist. Felt meaning feeling. So I think you gather that maybe this approach is somewhat less scientific, this deductive approach. Well, okay, so there's these two approaches. Which one are the scientists, say in physics and chemistry, using? Well, let's observe what they're doing. And by the way, which approach am I using? That is the inductive approach, when you observe the facts, the data, and that's the first step of scientific research. You observe particular phenomena, you gather the data, you organize the material, you categorize, you classify. As you do that, you observe certain patterns. That triggers the development of hypotheses. Whenever this appears, we see a bit later this happens. Therefore, maybe there's a link. That's a hypothesis you can test. As you keep testing and fail to reject, you build your theory, which is constantly subjected to empirical evaluation. Which approach is this? This is the inductive approach. That is inductive reasoning. Now, that is what scientists do, say in chemistry and physics. What do economists do? They first proclaim an axiom, namely the axiom of the individual being rational, maximizing only their utility, caring only about consuming and satisfaction, not caring about others. Therefore, of course, planet Earth, based on this axiom, is empty, because everyone has died when they were babies, because nobody cared for them. Then we add assumptions that we admit are not true, but for sake of argument, they're being put forward so that particular mathematical devices can be used according to the motto, well, I'm searching for my lost key under the lamppost at night, because that's where I can see. So the assumptions was what you heard in perfect information, complete markets, flexible prices, zero transaction costs, infinite lives, and so on. Wholly unrealistic. And then you create your scenario. So this is the deductive approach. How come economics is the only discipline that uses the deductive approach? Because, of course, by constructing this theoretical dream world based on unrealistic assumptions, you are talking about a different planet. Why on earth would you do that? Well, it's something, I mean, the deductive approach has one appealing side to it for certain people. It's something you can use in order to come to the right conclusion, the predetermined desired conclusion. So, for example, you want to prove that, you know, big business and banks should not be restricted because that would be inefficient to interfere in the markets. Then you work backwards and try to find out, well, what model gives me that assumption? And then you work backwards and say, what assumptions do I need to propose and proclaim in order to then be able to propose this model, which gives me my preferred conclusions? The final step is the most important one. Present in reverse order. Because, of course, you don't want to show your audience that you started with your conclusion and work backwards. Quite the contrary, you will pretend that you're an objective researcher. You will pretend to be a scientist. And you will say, oh, just for simplification purposes, temporarily, let's make some slight simplifying assumptions. We can later relax them. The later never happens, by the way. And then you postulate your model, and what you find is, oh, hey, presto, there is this conclusion. Government intervention is bad. Restriction on big business is bad. We should have deregulation, liberalization, and privatization. Surprise, surprise, the conclusion you had decided you would come to, and you'd defined and created the entire model in order to come to this conclusion. Of course, clearly that's unscientific. This reverse engineering, one could also call it charlatanism. And by working with the deductive method, economics is supremely susceptible to the adoption of this approach. I hope you recognize, or some of you recognize this picture. I hope you still had a bit of a childhood before being given the iPad and the mobile phone, looking into books. Well, those who don't recognize it, this is a picture from the original Alice in Wonderland book by Lewis Carroll. That's his fictional writer's name. And of course, you see here Alice herself flying by the hand of the Queen in Wonderland, flying through Wonderland. And there's an interesting dialogue here. Alice laughed. There's no use trying, she said. One can't believe impossible things. I dare say you haven't had much practice, said the Queen. When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Well, that's Alice in Wonderland. And that's not enough. Alice, and not even the Queen, could be good economists, because it's insufficient to only believe 6 impossible things and only before breakfast. You have to believe at least 8 impossible things all the time. Let's use the actuarial approach, which is a very pragmatic approach. Actuaries are interested in probabilities. And of course, ex post, you can establish those, then you try to use appropriate probabilities for the future. Let's say that the probability of one of these assumptions being true is more than 50%. So these assumptions are more likely to be true than not. We are being very generous here to the economics framework and the economists proposing equilibrium. Because, of course, in reality, the probability of one of these assumptions being true is not 55%, but in my view, is more like 0. But, just for sake of argument. The question I want to ask is, what is the probability of all 8 assumptions being true at the same time if the individual probability is 55%? It seems that the economists, although they claim to always, use mathematics and understand mathematics really well, didn't do their numbers appropriately, because the calculation is 0.55 to the power of 8. And the probability of all 8 assumptions holding, and therefore of having a chance of having equilibrium, if each assumption has a high probability of 55%, is less than 1%. And in reality, the individual probability is far lower. So we know markets can't be expected to clear. There is no equilibrium. And that throws out 99% of all modern economics, which is and has been for the better part of 200 years in the key proposals and theories and propositions. Equilibrium economics. There is no equilibrium. Markets don't clear, they're rationed, there's disequilibrium. And when you have disequilibrium, then demand doesn't equal supply. The short side principle applies. Whichever quantity of supply demand is smaller determines the outcome. And that means the short side has power to decide with who to trade. That's true for anything, even in financial markets. Of course, that will often be abused. The short side can extract benefits that are non-market benefits because, the other side wants to trade, but the short side can pick and choose with who to trade. So what are you going to give me? Let's look at money. What is the short side? Is it the demand or the supply? Which one is larger, the demand for money or the supply of money? Money has some unusual qualities. As a result, it's rather popular. And as a result, the demand for money is always larger than the supply. Therefore, the supply is the short side. Who supplies our money? That short side has the power. So who supplies our money? Where does money come from? Well, many of you will know this. Money is created by the banking system. Central banks themselves only create around 3% of the money supply, 97% is created by banks. Central banks, however, have power over banks and can manipulate the banks. This means that a lot of the power is concentrated in our banking system, especially in the hands of the central bank. And power, unfortunately, does tempt people a little bit too much. Most people can't handle power that results in corruption directly or indirectly or in an abstract sense. Banks create the money. They're not deposit-taking institutions that lend money. They're the creators of the money supply. The legal reality is that banks don't take deposits because there's no such thing as a deposit. Instead, if you have money at the bank, you think it's your money, well, you've lent it to the bank is the owner. It's simply a loan. Banks don't lend money, they purchase securities. A loan contract is a promissory note issued by the borrower that is purchased by the bank. Banks don't pay out the loan amount. Instead, they owe you and they make a record of their debt, which we call a deposit. Hey presto, and that's how deposits are created. There used to be 3 theories of how banks actually work and where the money comes from for a bank loan. The financial intermediation theory is the dominant one, which says banks don't create money. They just gather deposits and lend out those deposits. An older one is the fractional reserve theory, which says that individually banks are financial intermediaries, but in aggregate, somehow there's money created. And the oldest is the credit creation theory, which says that banks create money out of nothing. Now, the first 2 have been rejected empirically, again, because economists don't work scientifically. They're not interested in empirical evidence. I was the first to actually check empirically the 3 theories of banking, published in 2014, 2016. If you look it up, one paper is called "Can Banks Individually Create Money Out of Nothing?" The other one is called "Lost Century in Economics." They're open source, so please do get them. So if we work scientifically, as I have been doing and as I always try to do, and by the way, people ask me, what is your approach? Are you Keynesian? Are you monetarist? Neither, as you saw. These are all equilibrium economists living in a fictional world. I believe we should not create fictional stuff. We should describe reality, and for that we need the scientific approach. So I call this scientific economics. I think there's no reason why we can't use the scientific research methodology also in economics. The downside, of course, is that you can't control your conclusion, as the proponents of equilibrium economics have been wanting to do for 200 years. So we find that the credit creation theory is the only one that's not rejected by the empirical evidence, and the other theories are rejected. So banks create money out of nothing. When a bank gives out a loan, it purchases the loan contract and then credits the borrower's account with the money. The money for this for the borrower's account is not transferred anywhere inside or outside the bank. That's the system. Banks, therefore, are very powerful. They reshape the economic landscape, and central banks have been manipulating them, unfortunately, as well, the empirical record shows, mainly to create boom-bust cycles and crises and inflation, when really we don't have to have any of these. Abundance is possible, which is the title of my presentation, because once you understand credit creation, you realize that we can have full employment, we can have stable growth without business cycles, we don't have to have inflation, we don't have to deplete the environment, we can have abundance for everyone that is sustainable. We just need to be aware of the fundamental principles here, which I show in my general quantity theory, also known as the quantity theory of credit or quantity theory of disaggregated credit. The money supply is measured by credit creation in the banking system, and that can be used for GDP transactions, the green part here, for the real economy. If you've got more of that, then you get more nominal GDP growth. And it can be used for non-GDP transactions, which are asset transactions, and that will always then push up asset prices. That gives you three scenarios. So this asset credit is on the left side, which is one example of unproductive credit creation, which is unsustainable. It results in asset inflation and, as a result, also banking crises. And we have the other unsustainable example, that's consumption credit. This is what happened from March 2020 and also happened in the 1970s. Central banks forced banks to massively expand consumer credit and credit creation that was used for final goods and service consumption, resulting in a big boost to prices, and that's where the inflation comes from. So these two scenarios are case 1 and 2 to be avoided. Case 3, the green box, is really the redeeming feature of the banking system. In order to have economic growth, we need credit creation, and we will get economic growth without inflation and in a sustainable manner if we make sure banks create credit for productive purposes to implement new technologies, create value added that is sustainable. That's what we need to aim at. Which banking system delivers that well and avoids these crises is actually a decentralized financial system consisting of small local banks. But let me now use these tools that we've quickly developed, and some of you will have become aware of these, to analyze the 1970s inflation that allegedly was an energy price shock. What really was the cause? Well, let's look at the key variable, which is not the interest rate. That's a smoke screen. It is the quantity of credit creation. Let's look at US bank credit growth. Now, we do see 2 peaks in the 70s, hence 2 peaks in inflation. But let's look at the timing. And remember, the inflation, the oil price shock only started from October 1973. Well, bank credit growth had an initial peak in 1971 at 13.5%, a very high growth rate, and then peaked fully for this part of the cycle, for this half of the 70s, on the 1st of March 1973 in the US at 16.4% growth. Then it decelerated. Then in 77 and early 78, it accelerated again. So what we learn here is that what comes first is massive credit creation, and in this case for final consumption. That's true also for the other countries. We found that the credit boom started in 71, peaked in 73. In Germany, the first little peak there was 14.1% growth in 72, and the second and the final peak in the first half of the 70s was March 73, well ahead of this energy shock. And then you see the second peak again there at the end of the 70s, always ahead of the actual price movement. Same in Japan. Why was there 25% inflation? Well, because there was 25% credit growth, peaking in December 73, well before the so-called oil shock. And in fact, credit creation is usually a year, 12 months, or 18 months ahead. That is why in April, May 2020, I warned, and I'm, on the public record on Twitter, warning this and warning investors that we would get significant inflation 12 months to 18 months ahead. Why? Well, this QE that was implemented in 2020 was very different from the QE in 2008. The 2008 QE happened at a time when the gray line, this is bank credit, was totally collapsing, and the central bank, the blue line, injected money, as it turns out, actually not into the economy, as I explained at the time, but into the banking system. And as a result, overall, the money supply didn't rise very much. But if you now look at what happened in 2020, bank credit growth was already booming at one of the highest growth rates in the post-war era, and the central bank also created money. And even when central bank money creation later went down, bank credit continued to rise, and that bank credit was actually a forced expansion in bank credit, forced by the central bank through purchases of assets from the non-bank sector, which creates new deposits in the banking system, and they were then also through government policies used for consumption, final goods and service consumption. Here's a list of the top 7 claims by modern economists that are false. I mean, as a general rule, just do the opposite of what they say, and you'll be mostly doing quite well. Interest rates are supposed to be the key variable. Absolutely not true. Banks are financial intermediaries that take deposits and lend. Nope, not true. Markets are in equilibrium, so prices are key. Absolutely not. There's never been any evidence for that. First, for economic growth, you first need savings. They fund the investment and deliver growth. Well, look at the developing countries that have followed this IMF World Bank advice, and they have for 70 years not developed. Countries that did not follow this advice and instead used bank credit creation in the domestic economy have fared really well. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and since 78, China. And so on. So the story continues here. Just be very careful. Actually, just, because we are in a strange time since 2020, economics became the first scientific discipline that was systematically controlled top down to freeze out dissent and essentially have one mainstream view. So we find also that all the other techniques that we've seen since 2020, when opposing and very scientific opinions were frozen out, when they didn't fit the official government-imposed narrative. There's also been psyops in economics very early on, such as Soros's Institute for New Economic Thinking. The goal there is to get potential critics of the mainstream and make sure they stay within, as Chomsky puts it, certain permitted parameters of discourse, and just essentially don't upset the apple cart too much. So the reality is the opposite of what they tell you. Official truth is not actual truth. What are we going to do? How did central planners and also economists respond to this? They first, after the 2008 crisis, pushed interest rates to zero negative territory, ostensibly to stimulate the economy, but really that doesn't stimulate the economy, as you saw. Instead, it's harmful for the good banks that lend for productive business investment, the green box, and therefore you kill those good small local banks that lend to small firms for productive purposes. You get a consolidation in the banking system, In the last 30 years, we've had almost 10,000 banks disappear in the US. Since the ECB was created in those 22 years, 5,000 banks have disappeared in Europe. As a result, the quantity of credit for productive purposes has declined. Economic growth has come down. Why are central banks doing this? Well, they're also sensitizing us to the story that we should have zero growth because growth is bad for the environment. Well, because if you kill all the banks, you're not going to get growth. It's official ECB policy since Draghi in 2016 that there's allegedly too many banks in Europe. That's a bad thing. Of course, Germany has most banks. 80% of German banks are not-for-profit, small local community banks. That's why the German economy has been strong for 200 years. Time to kill them, time to kill the German economy. It didn't go fast enough. So since 2020, drastic Soviet-style restrictions on production. And since this year, February, March, sharp restrictions on energy supply are doing the job. Now, central banks are at the same time proposing to abolish cash. They tell us that cash is inefficient and various excuses, but of course, this war on cash means that the powers of the central planners increase because digital currencies are more prone to manipulation and give not only surveillance tools, but also control tools into the hands of central planners. And therefore, that's very dangerous. Cash is freedom, and digital currency means that it may be cut off, as we've seen. If you demonstrate against something, maybe your digital money is not going to work, whether it's PayPal, a credit card, or something else, or central bank digital currency. Central banks have also been pushing monetary reform. We need to abolish banks. Well, actually, it's good to have many banks. The more the better, the smaller the better. The small banks are more accountable. They can be accountable to the local communities where they're based. And therefore, that's what we need to ensure. We need to keep cash, and we should create many small banks. We should not abolish bank credit creation. But if you put this together, then no cash, abolish banks, all money is digital currency. That leads to this totalitarian centralized control. We need alternatives. We need decentralized finance. And that, of course, means also alternative tools, alternative currencies, cryptocurrencies as well, gold, cash, and local banks. And ideally in a very diversified and rich community setting where all these tools are available, then we have some kind of hedge against the centralizers and the central planners. We need to avoid this Orwellian dystopia that seems very much just around the corner. Of course, the central planners want the CBDC, the central bank digital currency, to be ideally some kind of physical implant, also this so-called transhumanist agenda where you put technical gadgets into your body, which I've advised strongly against. If you look at how bad the software by Microsoft is, do you really want to have implants of that type in your body? And of course, they're control tools as well. Because there's still clearly going to be resistance against that because it violates human dignity. It looks like universal basic income will be widely touted. You're going to get $1,000, $2,000 into your account every month. But of course, we've got to do this very efficiently. So you've got to have the chip implant, that sort of story. In some countries like Sweden, this has become, trialed and piloted. Most likely with lots of cash incentives to then generate articles for the newspapers to get more people to buy in. And of course, the reason why the billionaires are suddenly proposing universal basic income, which, just a few years earlier, they would have called a communist idea, and it's an old idea, is because that's going to be the bribe to get you to get locked into this digital prison. So I think I'll better come to the conclusion. I think you've already heard the key thoughts here. The biggest problem in the 20th century has been the concentration of power in the hands of the few with lack of accountability. We need to work against that by decentralizing, creating decentralized financial systems, including the Valhalla network, which is based on a decentralized autonomous organization, and also the goal to establish many community banks, which also generate returns, because banking is actually quite a profitable activity. If you do it well, you give an excellent service to people at very low cost, and you have a profitable and sound financial system, because decentralization is always more resilient. Also, the cooperative principle is an important one. Cooperative entities should be supported, support your local community shops. It's always better to let people govern themselves than try to impose control structures from above. I've got a few more slides in here that we won't have time, but here's a few more slides actually on the Valhalla network. You see the DAO here, phase one. There's one for-profit bank that's established first just to generate more cash and also a proof of concept of a certain set of ideas and business model. And then there's enough funding to set up quite a few community banks. If you want to join, do join us and get in touch. We've already raised significant funds and believe this is an exciting new avenue forward, in addition to our ongoing activities of setting up banks. Local First Community Interest Company does that. Also have a look at my book, Princes of the Yen. If you haven't heard any of the things I've said, there's a lot of background in this book from quantumpublishers.com. Thank you very much. I will leave it at that.
Professor Werner, thank you. This was quite interesting presentation, and I think there's quite a lot of details to unpack in this. So we do have a few questions from the audience. So Nikita Guerin, who we met at Oxford at your
oh yes, indeed. How are you?
Yeah, actually I met him last week as well. But he asked a question. In quarter two 2022, the US GDP contracted, and since early 2022, both Treasury yields and federal funds rates have been on a steady rise, with 5-year rates hitting 4%. And as you probably know, it's an inverted yield curve. And should we expect higher rates of growth because the rates are going up? If this is not a leading indicator, what might 4% 5-year yield be signaling?
Excellent. Yes, thank you for that question. That's a very good one. The way you have to look at this, that the massive money creation in 2020 boosted nominal GDP significantly. Nominal GDP, you see, and most of that, or a big chunk of that, is inflation. That was something that was not priced into the system, including into bond markets. So that had to be priced. And that's why, of course, it was inevitable that interest rates, long bond yields would go up. That is just reflecting this inflationary boost, and it's still in line with what I've told you, because nominal growth rose first, boosted artificially in 2020. That means later rates go up to match that, you see. So the rates follow growth. The yield curve inversion is indicative of the fact that, well, the real growth is, of course, far weaker than the nominal growth. We have inflation, and really there's signs of recession. That's not surprising. We have artificial restrictions on economic activity of a type unseen. Since 2020, and first it was some kind of cold or flu as an excuse. Now we have some kind of military operations as excuse. So whatever the excuse, the fact is we have unprecedented Soviet-style restrictions on corporate activities that cannot but harm economic growth. And if you cut companies off from energy, that's more important than even the price as such. the quantities always dominate. There are many companies that are now shutting down because they have problems procuring sufficient energy. So it's not surprising. And so that's, of course, why there's recessionary signs, including the inverted yield curve.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And in fact, the high energy restrictions that are basically being imposed through fiat are quite astounding. So in Germany, shutting down nuclear plants for no reason, even like wind power, a lot of it is shut down right now. And also geopolitical reasons, they don't have enough energy resources. I wanted to just ask your opinion, like, why do you think this is happening? Because if you look at what government officials are saying in Germany or the US, or even in Japan to some extent, it really seems to be counterproductive in an obvious way. And it seems like there has to be some kind of reason why they would want to do this.
Yes. Well, the benign explanation is that the United States doesn't care about its allies and the welfare of its allies, such as, Germany, European countries. It wanted to and continues to want to harm Russia and to some extent China, and is happy to do anything. And if the European countries are stupid enough to follow US instructions, the Americans say, well, that's great, but let's try to harm Russia. As it turns out, it didn't harm Russia in a significant way. It harmed Europe a lot, but the decision makers in America don't care about that. Now, that's the benign story, okay? Do you want to hear the less benign story? But maybe you can guess yourself.
Well, I can guess. In many ways, it seems like what you describe in Princes of the Yen is kind of a trial run. And the tools are a little bit different, but the outcome, of course, is structural change. They want ESG and to push different things like this. So
yeah, exactly.
At least that's what they say. So I was quite surprised because since 2020 in Japan as well, all the major funds and like Nomura and people like that, they talk quite a lot about ESG. In fact, I subscribe to many newsletters and I get almost daily invites to watch online talks, and yeah, it's almost maybe 90% ESG related. So
yeah, exactly. Which is, once you look into this, that's a whole other story. We could spend a few seminars and talks about, because does that within its own parameters actually even make sense? Is very, very doubtful. I mean, I'm a fan of clearly protecting the environment and having sustainable growth. But to me, it's clear that growth as such is not the enemy, and restricting economic activity can never be a solution, because you're creating a crisis, you're creating huge costs to such an extent that process itself is going to harm the environment, as we've seen already. I mean, now they're powering up coal and the more harmful sources of energy. Not surprising, well, what do you expect? So it's full of contradictions. And again, the question is, what is the real purpose? And it does seem that that's just the official story, and the real story is different. For example, Europe, a decision was made to shut down Europe as an economic power or economic competitor. That seems to be quite a consistently pursued goal, and we're well on track on that one.
Yeah, that's I guess we'll have to see how that plays out. Given what you know about the potential motives, do you think that the Fed will start to do more QE and try to get the world out of this mess, or are they doing it now, for instance? I haven't seen any talk about QE, but just interest rate show games.
It'll be very interesting, especially because, as you say, it is entirely a policy variable. It could well be that they're copying the 1970s playbook very closely. And remember, there we had the first bout of inflation, then they let it settle back. Also, inflation actually did come back a bit. Then they had another round. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're going to do that again. On the other hand, there's also another type of inflation scenario that we should not forget about. It's always good to look in economic history because there's so many very similar scenarios. And we need to remain aware of what happened in the early 1920s, just 100 years ago in Germany, where the inflation was, of course, there were also initially ups and downs, but then it moved to a rapidly and exponentially accelerating phase. So that'll be the key thing to watch for, because, of course, that means we're heading very quickly towards a major disaster also on the in terms of purchasing power of standard currencies. So yeah, we need to keep our eyes open. The sad thing is that we cannot trust the decision makers to aim for the beneficial scenarios and general welfare. That does not empirically seem to be what they're aiming at.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the case, and what they do seems to be completely arbitrary, and so it's really it's kind of not visible what they could do. One of the people who watched your presentation writes, do you think we actually need a credit-based system? I guess they mean a debt currency system. Even for productive purposes, this creates an asynchronous risk-reward profile for equity holders and that use credit for their business. Wouldn't it be more sustainable and better aligned economic incentives if all investments would be done via equity financing, is what they ask.
Yes, however, the advantage of the debt-based system, of the credit-based system, is this credit creation process. You see, because we wouldn't have had all this prosperity without the credit creation of the good type. Because in order to have more economic growth and have, there's the whole other story about, what growth actually means, but, it's a national income accounting concept. And what we've arbitrarily defined as GDP or GNP, it does matter, actually. It is, for our societies, almost necessary to have that expanding for various reasons, whether it's the fiscal and pension system or also the demographic developments to maintain financial stability there, and so on and so on. So various reasons we do need that sort of growth. It's not harmful for the environment because it's just a statistical artifact, and statistical artifacts can't hurt the environment. If you created a scenario with zero growth, then problems will get much bigger. That's the reality. For growth, we need credit creation. That's the system we've had since modern capitalism came onto the stage in this 17th century. But actually, I would argue it's even older, because also the earlier form of capitalism, we already had bank credit creation and credit expansion. If you have an equity-based system, I do see this appeal that there's no creation of debt, there's not this liability overhang and the pressure from liabilities, but you can't create equity as easily, you see, because equity are finite, and if there's a pure equity system, then there's no expansion in the money supply, and therefore there cannot be economic growth in the sense that we're used to. So it will be quite a different world. One would have to perhaps play this through, and perhaps one should have some pilot projects where certain communities actually try to implement that, and that'd be a very interesting study. But that will be my main response, that you will not get this prosperity. And if you look at the high growth countries that have really maxed out on what you can do with a credit creation system, and that is high growth Japan for 2 decades, high growth Korea for 3 decades, and high growth China for 4 decades, double-digit economic growth, which means that, with say 10% economic growth every 7 years, you double national income, you double it in absolute terms. So this prosperity, and in China, of course, more people lifted out of poverty than at any time in history before. on the planet, this wouldn't have happened in an equity-based system. Therefore, there's pros and cons, but if you run it well, a credit-based system can be extremely successful and make the majority better off. Of course, there's downsides, particularly if it gets abused and the wrong decisions are made by centralized planners, which again means we should strive for decentralization.
Yeah, it seems to be a problem of governance. So under the right governance, the system can work well, but under poor governance, it doesn't. That's actually what we're trying to solve with SORA as a decentralized autonomous organization, doing the allocation decisions democratically. But I have one final question for you, and that's developing countries like Sri Lanka have had a hard time with their economy recently. This is because, well, the mainstream explanation is that it's because they import too many goods that have to be paid for in dollars, and they don't have enough dollars. So basically, they can't pay for these goods, and they borrow money 14 times from the IMF and do things like this. How would a country like that get out of a problem like they have now, where they don't produce enough domestically, and everyone wants dollars, and they feel that they don't have at this time the resources to build everything domestically? So basically, it's a small country that doesn't have the resources that at least they think they need to have a sustainable domestic economy.
Yes, well, essentially they've been on the wrong development path, which is a non-development path. They followed the IMF World Bank advice. They even followed most recently the World Economic Forum advice. They even shut down farms. So they did what the globalists have been demanding, and you see the result is disaster and no development. The only countries that have developed are the ones that ignored the IMF World Bank advice. And so countries like that, what they really should have been doing is to look at what they can and want to do in their economies, do that well, support education, get an educated workforce, and then trade with those countries that want to buy whatever goods or services they can produce. And there are quite a few. And of course, Sri Lanka, if you look at the people, they have the same, I think, potential and abilities of their neighbors in India, no doubt. They could also be IT and computer experts, and there could be a lot of demand for that. So, India invested a lot in the training and PhD programs for decades, was criticized for doing so much educational expenditure. Well, it has paid off, certainly in quite a few high-tech sectors. And if you then at the same time, as you do that and develop your certain industries that you want to encourage, you watch what you're importing and just make sure you don't have unnecessary, say, luxury goods and imports that don't really help the country and are not really needed. And you can shape the incentive structure there a bit to make sure that if you import stuff, it will be stuff that will plug into your domestic development. You will see you will get a much more stable balance of payments. And as you rev up exports, it becomes possible to buy more abroad. And if you then just watch your budget, if you're exporting more, you get rewarded, so to speak. Then you can buy a few more, say the final high-end luxury goods. If you don't follow those principles, then of course you're going to overspend and you're going to get into debt and run out of money. That's true for everyone. So it was the deceptive policies by the IMF and the World Bank and the World Economic Forum that they followed, and sadly that's what we see is the result that you get.
Yeah, it's just hard to get out of a situation like that when you're in it, because they're looking at potentially people starving because they don't have enough.
Which is very sad, entirely avoidable. And of course, you should, at this stage where you've now with this disastrous policy combination caused this crisis, you have to take emergency measures. You have to restrict imports of unnecessary things. You focus only on necessary things, but you also crank up immediately your domestic food production. Well, last year they did the opposite. They shut down food production following World Economic Forum advice on, we need to reduce nitrogen and things like that. Well, if you wanted people to starve, and also the CO2 limits don't really make sense, because actually CO2 is not as bad as it's made out to be, which is another big topic to look into. But clearly for a country like that, these were the wrong priorities. You have to quickly reverse those, focus on what's important, crank up food production. Imports should only be necessary things like food and so on. You will get help from neighbors. Neighbors are happy to help. India helps, China helps, many international entities have been helping. You can put together a package that's workable, and then change those fundamental policies and actually develop the economy in a sustainable fashion, and not just following blindly what the World Economic Forum and the IMF and the World Bank are saying.
Yeah, it's good advice, and I do hope that they can figure out how to do this, and get back to the right track. But yeah, unfortunately, it seems like everyone thinks the IMF is a magic bullet. So the 14 times didn't work, so the 15th time will suddenly be magic. But yeah, it's really heartbreaking to watch, because they did have a very high human development index, and a lot of the smart people, left the country, and that it's going to take decades to reverse. In many ways, Russia has the same problem too, with the people leaving the country. So
yes, and actually, and thanks for making that point. Russia too, and Sri Lanka. I mean, in that sense, there are some abstract parallels. The weakness is that they did not develop the core of the economy, which is the sort of middle class in terms of people, and the Mittelstand, the SME, small and medium-sized enterprise sector in terms of companies and corporate sector. If you have a strong such middle sector, then you have a sustainable economy. If you don't have that, it's an economy of extremes and too much inequality, and the whole thing is far too fragile. And then when the shock comes, the whole thing easily collapses. But how do you develop this center core of your economy? The vast majority of jobs are with small and medium-sized enterprises, 70% of employment. They cannot survive, and they are not sustainable without banks lending to them, but only small banks will lend to them. So really what's been missing in Russia, in Sri Lanka, and in many countries is a big layer, a network of small local community banks that offer very low cost, but highly efficient, very professional, very effective services of all the financial services to small local players, allowing small companies to thrive and become global exporters. And that's, of course, what happened in Germany, also Switzerland, Austria, and these countries have fared extremely well. Sadly, the globalists are killing that off because they don't like this middle class and this Mittelstand SME sector, because that means that communities are independent, they have their own opinion, and they don't necessarily follow the diktat from the central planners. And so that seems to be the big policy drive since March 2020, to kill small firms, to kill, therefore, I think it's their interpretation, the local resistance, and then the rest can be steamrolled, and that's why they seem to be willing to have all this destruction and economic mayhem. But we need to do the opposite. We need to build these communities, and I think alternative currencies can play a role in this, but certainly also small local banks.
Yeah, I do hope that that somehow we can find a solution. So if governments don't want to help their citizens, maybe cryptocurrency projects can offer a kind of a third way. But yeah, I think we've taken quite a lot of your time, and I really appreciate your answers. They were very, very good. And yeah, these are crazy times we live in. They're very chaotic. One of the problems, of course, that Sri Lanka had was that in 2020 to 2021, they basically shut down a third of their GDP or more, because of all the tourism was shut down because of their restrictions. So really sad to see this happening again and again, because it's very preventable, right? So it's human created response, and it could be done in many different ways. So as an engineer, it's quite frustrating to watch, because
Yes,
you can
must
see
be.
that things can be different in so many ways.
Exactly, I agree. Great.
So,
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your time, and enjoy wherever you are. Have fun with the cowbells and the cows. We couldn't actually hear any cowbells, so it's okay.
Yes,
But,
it's great. Very soothing.
Looks beautiful. So yeah, have a good time, and good luck with your research. So thanks a lot.
Excellent. Great. Thanks very much. I'll say goodbye. Thank you. Bye-bye.